Let us just start by looking at our lesson plan. Now, on our lesson plan today, we have what is the nervous system, which is what we're supposed to discuss today. We are going to discuss what is the nervous system, what is the nervous system made up of, and then we're going to discuss the central nervous system, or the CNS in abbreviation, and then we're going to discuss the brain and the structures of the brain and the functions of the structures of the brain. And then we're going to look at the nervous tissue, which is the three types of neurons. And then we're going to look at the reflex arc, and then we're going to look at the reflex action. Most people confuse the two, but I will just differentiate them because they're not the same. And then we're going to look at the peripheral nervous system, which is abbreviated as the PNS. And then we're going to look at the types of the receptors. And last but not least, we're going to look at a brief summary of the entire topic that we are going to discuss today. Now, moving to our next slide. As I told you guys, we need to know what is the nervous system. Now, the nervous system is a system that is responsible for processing and transmitting information throughout the body. And it tells the body how to react to stimuli, which is the changes in the environment. And then it coordinates the various or the different activities of the body, for example, walking, hearing, and seeing. And the human nervous system is actually divided into two sections or two parts. We have the central nervous system, the CNS, and we have the peripheral nervous system. Now, we are going to start by looking at the central nervous system. Now, the central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord only. Remember, the central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. Now, the brain is a particular structure which is protected by the bones of the cranium. The cranium is the part of the skull and is surrounded by the three layers of the membrane, membranes, or what we call the meninges, which they are for protection. The brain is what is protected by the cranium and also by the three layers which we call the meninges. And the brain consists of what we call the cortex, which is the gray matter. And then this cortex, it consists of what we call the cell bodies. And then we're going to look at the medulla oblongata of the brain as well, which consists of the nerve fibers or the axons and is called the white matter. The brain is made up of two different components. It's made up of what we call the gray and the white matter. Now, the spinal cord is protected by what we call the vertebral column or the vertebrae, and is also protected by what we call the cerebrospinal fluid, which is a very important and a very special fluid. It plays a very important role. And the nerves from the body parts enter the spinal cord as 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And the spinal cord is the pathway for all the impulses that are conducted or transmitted to and from the brain, and also processes what the reflex actions. And we have got what we call the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nerve impulses, which are conducted along the spinal cord to all organs. You're going to understand what I'm trying to explain here when you're looking at the diagram. Now, let us just look at the brain. Remember, our brain, unfortunately, I don't have that structure at this moment, but I'm going to describe the structure of the brain. Now, the brain is made up of two hemispheres, and these hemispheres, they are separated by a particular structure, which is what I'm going to actually discuss with you. It's one of the parts of the brain. Now, these hemispheres, We have the right one and the left one. Now, the right hemisphere controls the left part of the body, and then the left hemisphere controls the right part of the body. Now, before we move forward, I want us to look at the three layers that surrounds the brain, which we call the meninges. We have the dura mater, the arachnoid, and the pia mater. What I call them the DAP, in order for me to remember them. Now, these layers, as I'm labeling them here, as I labeled, sorry, them here, they follow like each other as they are here. This is the outermost layer, and then this one, the arachnoid, is the middle layer, and then this one is the innermost layer. And then between the middle layer and the innermost layer, which is the arachnoid and the pia mater, we have got a very special fluid which plays a pivotal role, which is called the cerebrospinal fluid. Now, let us just look at the parts of the brain. Now, the brain has a cerebrum, which is this part here, the biggest portion of the brain. And then it has the corpus callosum, the structure here. And then it has the medulla oblongata, which is this part here. And then it has the hypothalamus, which is the part here above the medulla, but below the corpus callosum. And then it has the part here, which is this part, which is called the cerebellum. Now, people confuse these two structures, the cerebrum and the cerebellum. They are two different structures, guys. They are not the same. The cerebrum is the biggest portion of the brain, but the cerebellum is smaller than the cerebrum. And they have different functions as well. Now, the cerebrum, it controls the voluntary actions. Whatever that you decide to do is controlled by this part here. And also, it receives and interprets sensations from the sense organs like your eye, like your ear, like your nose. It interprets what data or information. And also, it is the higher thought it's responsible for higher thought processes like thinking, memory, and so forth. And then we have got this part here, the corpus callosum. Since I discussed with you guys that the brain consists of two hemispheres, the right and the left hemispheres. Now, those two hemispheres, they are connected by this part here, which is the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum, its function is to connect the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. And also it allows these two hemispheres to communicate with each other. Remember, the right hemisphere controls the left part of the body, and the left hemisphere controls the right part of the body. Now, looking at the structure here below the corpus callosum, but above the medulla oblongata, is what we call the hypothalamus. This structure, what does it do? It is a control center for hunger, for thirst, for sleep, for body temperature and emotions. This part here, it tells you that you are hungry. You have to eat. If you don't eat, now you become hungry, and then this part here is going to be stimulated to tell your body to eat. And also when you are thirsty, it does the same thing. It tells your body to drink water. It also tells your body to sleep when you are tired or when it's time for you to sleep. And then also it controls the body temperature. If the body temperature is above normal, this part here is stimulated. And once it is stimulated, the body temperature is decreased through some processes which we are going to discuss when we do homeostasis. And also it controls your emotions. Sadness, anger, frustrations, and so forth, they are controlled by this part. And then now looking at the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata, it transmits impulses between the spinal cord and the brain. You see, it's between, remember here, we have the continuation of the spinal cord. This medulla oblongata is in continuation with the spinal cord. And here above it, we have the brain. So it transmits impulses from the spinal cord to the brain, between the spinal cord and the brain. And also it controls the actions, involuntary actions such as heartbeat. Your heartbeat is not controlled by you. It's controlled, it's involuntary, it's controlled by the medulla oblongata. Also, breathing is not controlled by you. You don't decide to breathe in and out. Your body decides on its own. So this part controls that breathing. And then we've got the cerebellum, this part here. The cerebellum, it coordinates all the voluntary movements, such as running, such as walking. So it coordinates all those movements, the ones that you decide to do. I can decide to run, I decide to walk, I decide to jump, and all those things. And then it controls muscle tension to maintain balance. Now, moving forward, we have what we call the nervous tissue. And the nervous tissue consists of a complex system called neurons or nerve cells. And those neurons are adapted to conduct or transmit and react to stimuli. They transmit information, and once that information is transmitted, therefore we are going to respond or react to whatever change that occurs in the environment. Now, the first neuron that we're going to look at, or the first nervous tissue that we're going to look at, is what we call the sensory neuron. So these sensory neurons, they are unipolar. They've got one pole, and some are bipolar, which means they have two poles. And then these sensory neurons, they always conduct impulses from the receptor. What is a receptor? A receptor, it is a structure that receives the stimuli. It is the structure that is stimulated if maybe the change in the environment occurs. And then it transmits those impulses from the receptor to the central nervous system, which is the spinal cord and the brain for interpretation. And then we have got the motor neurons. The motor neurons, they are multipolar. They are multipolar, meaning they've got more than two poles. And then these neurons have many dendrites. You're going to see those dendrites when we look at their structures. Now, the multipolar neurons or the motor neurons, they always carry what impulses away from the central nervous system, which is the spinal cord and the brain. Now, the difference between the sensory neurons and the motor neurons is that the sensory neurons, they always conduct impulses from the receptor to the CNS. The information is taken to the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. But when it comes to the motor neurons, the information is taken away now from the CNS to the effector, to the structure that is stimulated to respond to the stimuli, like your muscles. Now, the connector neuron or the interneurons, these ones, they connect the sensory neurons to the motor neurons. Connects that sensory neurons to motor neurons in the spinal cord and the brain. And also they transmit information as well. But the main function is to connect the two, the motor neuron and the sensory neuron. Now, moving right along, these are the structures that I was just discussing on our previous slides. Now, we're just going to look at the two diagrams. Now, you need to be able to know how to draw these structures, because in an exam, you might be asked to draw them and label them, or they might draw them for you and then you will have to label them and give their function. You might be asked like a few questions about them. Now, here we have the motor neuron, which is multipolar. This part here is what we call the dendrites, these parts here. They're called the dendrites. They take away the information from the CNS. The information is received by the dendrites from the CNS, and then it goes down this structure here. This is what we call the axon. All these neurons, they have axon, the structure called the axon, which transmits an impulse from the cell body to the effector in the motor neurons. Now, these axons, they're actually myelinated, or they are covered by a certain sheath. Now, that sheath is what we call the myelin sheath. Now, what does it do? It insulates this structure so that it does not lose any electrical impulses. This part here. Now, we have got this part here, the spaces between these structures which cover the axon. Those spaces is what we call the nodes of Ranvier. These parts here, they are called the nodes of Ranvier. And then this part here is the muscle. And then this muscle is what we call the effector, because it's the one that is stimulated to cause movement when maybe you're supposed to move your hand away from a hot plate or from a hot surface. And then now we have our sensory neuron. Our sensory neuron, it transmits information from the receptor, which is this part here, maybe the fingertip. And then now that information is converted into an impulse in the sensory neuron, and then is taken to the CNS for interpretation. Now we also have an axon here, which is covered by what? The myelin sheath. And then this axon now, it transmits information from the receptor to the cell body, and then from the cell body, it goes to the CNS. And then now we have another important neuron, which is what we call the interneuron or the connector neuron. So this connector neuron, it also has an axon, but unfortunately, the axon of the interneuron is not covered by the myelin sheath. And then what you need to also know is that now, when you look at the structure, when you look at the motor neuron, now on our motor neuron, we have a cell body. This part here is a cell body. This part here, it's very important. It's the cell body. And then also here, we have a cell body, which is here. This is our cell body here. And then also the interneuron has got a cell body, which is very small. It's here. This is our cell body. This is our cell body. The cell body consists of a nucleus there. As you can see, they have a nucleus, and so forth. Now, you need also to understand how the impulses move along these structures. Now, when the information comes now, this is the receptor. Obviously, the information is received. Therefore, it's going to go down and comes here. This is the control center. And then it goes and goes, it comes here. This part is connected to the, actually, we have this diagram here. Let's just look at the pathway of the impulses. Now, the sensory neuron, it has got dendrites. Now, these dendrites, they are attached to the receptor or the structure that receives the stimuli. Now, when a stimuli is received, it goes through these dendrites, and then it goes to the axon, which is covered by the myelin sheath for insulation to prevent electrical loss. Now, as the impulses, they are moving or propagating, they go to the cell body here, which is a very important structure because it controls the processes that occur here. And then the impulse that comes from the cell body is taken away from the cell body by the axon, and then it goes and goes, and then it goes to the interneuron. This is the interneuron, number 2. Number 1 is sensory, which receives stimuli. Number 2 is the interneuron, which connects the two. Now, the information comes here. It goes to the brain for interpretation, and then it comes back, and then it goes to the motor neuron. Now, to the motor neuron, this part of the synaptic knobs, yes, the synaptic knobs of the interneuron, they are attached to the dendrites of the motor neuron. And then the information or the impulses that are transmitted now from the CNS, they go to the dendrites, and then the cell body, which is the control center, which contains the nucleus. And then what happens is that it goes down the axon. You see the direction here. Goes down here towards the effector, which is the structure that's going to be stimulated to respond to stimuli. And then we are going to look at the reflex arc and the reflex action. Now, what is the reflex action? Or what is the difference between the reflex action and the reflex arc? Now, the reflex action is a quick, automatic, or involuntary action that involves the spinal cord and does not involve the brain. It is an important function which is to protect the body from harm. What happens, this particular action, it happens so quick and it's automatic, which means it's not voluntary. So it's not you who decides on what to do, it decides for you. Now, the reflex arc is actually the pathway along which the impulse are transmitted to bring about a response to stimulus during a reflex action. This is the pathway. This is an action. This is what happens when maybe you receive a particular harmful change in the environment. Now, I'm going to describe what I mean by a dangerous or a harmful change in the environment. Now, when you look at the structure here, you see this person, there's a candle there, and then there's fire there, which produces heat. Now, when you expose your fingertip to this fire, what happens? Because this fire is very hot. Now, this particular place now is called, or this particular structure is called the receptor, because it receives the stimuli, it receives the heat from the candle, which is in the environment. Now, once the heat is received, the heat, it goes into the sensory neuron, where it is converted into what? An impulse. And then that impulse is taken from the receptor. It goes and it goes what? It goes through this part here, the dorsal, I forgot, the dorsal horn is the dorsal horn. And then it comes into this part, is the spinal cord. Now, as it comes to the spinal cord, it comes and comes and comes. And then interpretation occurs there in the spinal cord, and then the information is taken from the spinal cord into the interneuron, from the interneuron into the motor neuron, and then the motor neuron transmit the impulses to the muscles here, the effector. Then you will move your what? Your fingertip away from the heat because you are getting burned. The information has been interpreted in the spinal cord. And now your body is aware that you are getting what? Burned. Therefore, you need to protect yourself by removing what? Your fingertip away from this heat. That's it. We are done. The information goes to the spinal cord via the dorsal horn, and then it comes back via it goes into the spinal cord via the dorsal horn, and then it leaves the spinal cord via the anterior horn. The dorsal horn is also called the posterior horn. This part here is called the anterior horn. It leaves via the anterior horn, and then it goes to your effector. Now, what will happen? You're gonna pull away your fingertip or this finger, and then you protect yourself from getting bent. And what you need to also discuss, this is the spinal cord. Now, the spinal cord has two parts, the gray matter, which is inside, and the white matter outside. But in the brain, it's the opposite. The white matter is inside and the gray matter is outside. And then in the exam, guys, you will be given this structure. And it will be labeled like, okay, it's A, this is A, this is B, this is C, this is D, this part here is D, and then this is what? E. Now, they will ask for the pathway. How is it moving? You're going to have to say it starts from A, the receptor, It goes to B, the sensory neuron, which transmits the information into the spinal cord. And then it goes to the C, which is the interneuron or the connector neuron. From the connector neuron, it goes to the motor neuron. And then from the motor neuron, it goes to the effector, the structure, which produces the reaction, which responds to the change. In this case, you want to pull away your finger to protect yourself from getting bent. That's it. That's the pathway. It's what the receptor, the sensory neuron, the interneuron, and then from the interneuron to the motor neuron and to the effector. That's it. Now, let us look at the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is all the other nerves that are on the periphery of your body. They're not at the center of your body. The periphery of your body is the, how can I put it? Yeah, it's the periphery, away from the central part of the body. Remember, your spinal cord and your brain, they are central part of your nervous system. But now the periphery is made up of sensory cells that respond to stimuli. These sensory cells are called what we call the receptors. When the receptors are stimulated or triggered, the stimulus is converted into a nerve impulse. For a stimuli to be interpreted, it must turn into a nerve impulse, guys. And then the nerve impulse is transmitted along the sensory neurons to the central nervous system. That's it. The peripheral nervous system consists of all the nerves which they respond to stimuli and they receive the stimuli from the receptors. And then we have got the autonomic nervous system. Now, the peripheral nervous system is differentiated into the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. But now what we're going to discuss is the autonomic nervous system, which controls many vital activities in the body in order to maintain homeostasis. We are going to discuss homeostasis, guys. Not now. It's a chapter on its own. Now, it consists of nerves which are conducted to the hypothalamus of the central nervous system. This system functions involuntarily and automatically. It's automatic, it's autonomic, guys, which means automatic. Now, it is subdivided into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems that function antagonistically against each other. If this other goes positive, the other goes negative. If the other one says black, the other one says white. That is what is meant by antagonistically. Now, the sympathetic nerves stimulate organs to prepare the body for action. And then the parasympathetic slows down the system and brings the body back to a state of rest. Now, what you need to know is that the sympathetic nervous system is what we call fight and flight or fight. Is fight or flight is. When you are scared or when you are frightened, this sympathetic nervous system is stimulated and then it prepares the body for action. Maybe in case you are frightened by a lion, this sympathetic nervous system becomes stimulated. It becomes stimulated. Once it becomes stimulated, you will start running. It prepares your organs. For instance, now in this case, it's going to prepare your muscles. You're going to start running away from the lion. And then the parasympathetic nervous system slows down and bring the body back to a state of rest. Each organ in the body is supplied with nerves from both systems and is termed the double innervation. Double meaning the body organ, any body organ, it is innervated by the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nerves to bring about change. If one says yes, the other one says no, and then the organs are stimulated sympathetic part or inhibited by the parasympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system. Now, let's just look at the difference between sympathetic and parasympathetic. How do they oppose each other? How do they act antagonistically towards each other? Now we are looking at the organs and we're going to look at the sympathetic nervous system, what it does, and what does the parasympathetic nervous system does. The parasympathetic is what we call the rest and digest. And the sympathetic part is what we call the flight or fight. Now, the pupil of the eye. When, to remember this thing, you need to give an example. Like when you see a lion coming towards you or running towards you. Obviously, a lion is a very dangerous animal. You will start to be frightened. Once you start to get frightened, what you do, you start running. Now, for you to be able to run to a safe area, you must see that area. Therefore, your pupil becomes dilated so that you see clearly. Okay? But now, because here you are resting, you're not afraid of anything, you're not running to whatever place, your pupil is constricted. Okay, so what you can do actually here, you need to actually know what the sympathetic happens. The parasympathetic is the opposite of what the sympathetic does. And then when it comes to the sweat glands, what is happening is that the sweat secretion is increased, especially when it's hot. You start sweating to cool your body down. But now, this one, it does what? It decreases sweat secretion. For instance, when it's cold, you can't sweat a lot when it's cold because you're going to lose so much heat. And then you're going to experience what we call low body temperature, which is called hypothermia, which is a very dangerous condition. Your body is supposed to be at a particular state. It's supposed to be at a particular optimum temperature. Once the temperature decreases, your body will not function properly. And then now, the heart rate. When you're scared, running away from the lion, your heart starts to beat faster. Why? Because you need more nutrients and more oxygen to be supplied to your muscles so that you're able to run. You need more power to run. So what's going to supply power to your muscles is the nutrients and the oxygen. But when you are resting, the heartbeat just goes normally. You don't need any energy because you are resting and you're digesting the food. And also the small intestines now decrease peristalsis and blood flow. Now you can't digest food when you are running. You can't eat while you are running. That's a fact, you can't. So peristalsis it's being decreased and blood supply is decreased in the small intestines. But during parasympathetic nervous system, your peristalsis is increased and the blood supply is increased. Remember guys, parasympathetic is rest and digest. So when your digestion occurs, peristalsis occurs. Therefore, there must be intense peristalsis. So peristalsis has to be increased. Now the arteries to the skin, they're constricted in the sympathetic part, pale color, skin color, but they dilate normal skin color. And then arteries to the muscles, they dilate to increase blood flow, which is true, so that more nutrients and oxygen they are supplied to your muscles. These nutrients are important for production of what we call ATP, which we did in grade I think grade 11 when you did cellular respiration. And yeah, that's it. But they constrict during digestion and rest. So to decrease the blood flow, less nutrients and oxygen means less ATP. When you're resting, you don't need enough, like too much energy. Guys, you need to know just the sympathetic part. This part, it's the opposite. That's how I used to ace this. Now, bladder, it contracts. H to urinate. That's why most people, when they are scared, they urinate. But when you are digesting and just resting, it just relaxes. Sorry, guys, the bladder, yes, it contracts so that you urinate, but here it doesn't contract, it relaxes. And then the liver, glucagon, which is the stored glucose. Glucose is stored in the body in a form of glucagon. Sorry, guys, sorry. We're gonna discuss this when we do the endocrine system. This is actually a hormone, yes, which stimulates the release of glucose. Yes, sorry, guys. Glycogen is the form of glucose stored in your liver for later use. Maybe you need energy in future. So energy is stored in your body as glycogen. And if maybe you don't have energy, this glucagon is going to stimulate what? The release of glucose. And then also insulin is released to stimulate the storage of glucose. I think, guys, I need to actually have a video whereby I'm going to explain this because it's really a very complicated chapter. Now, moving right along, we're going to look at the types of receptors. Now, we have the receptors, and these ones, they respond to the stimuli from the outside part of the body and are found in the skin, the nose, the tongue, and the eyes and the ears. External, they respond to the stimuli that's coming from the outside of the body. External means outside. Receptors, structure that receives what? The stimuli. And then we've got the photoreceptors, which are sensitive to light stimuli, for example, the eye. Photo means what? It means light. And then chemoreceptors, chemo means chemical. So this one is sensitive to chemicals such as a solution or a gas. For example, the tongue and the nose. And then we've got mechanoreceptors, which are sensitive to changes in pressure, such as sound, touch, sound, gravitational stimuli. For example, the ear, the skin, the muscles, and tendons. And then we have got the interoreceptors. These ones that respond to chemical and physical changes inside the body to maintain homeostasis, which is what we are going to discuss, not now. And then we have got the chemoreceptors here in the aortic arc, and the carotid arteries are stimulated by the incorrect pH levels of the blood. Maybe if your pH levels are decreased, your body starts to become very acidic. So these receptors, they are what? They are stimulated. And then thermoreceptors, these ones are sensitive to heat and cold. When it's very cold outside, what happens is these thermoreceptors, they receive the stimuli. And then once they receive the stimuli, the information is transmitted via the sensory neurons, and then it goes to your central nervous system for interpretation and so forth, and then to bring about a change or a response so that you do not lose, so that you do not shake or shiver, because once it's cold, you start shivering. Now, what will happen is that your body won't release heat outside. You won't sweat. You're going to maintain the heat inside your body so that the temperature in the body stays at a moderate level. We're going to discuss that when we do homeostasis. And then we've got osmoreceptors, which are sensitive to the changes in the osmotic pressure of the blood, osmosis. We're going to do that as well. I think you did this in grade 11 or 10, if I'm not mistaken. You did osmosis and so forth. And then we've got the baroreceptors, which are sensitive to changes in blood pressure. They're located mainly in the aortic arc. Now, let us just look at our summary, guys. Now, the nervous system consists of two parts, guys. It consists of the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and also consists of the peripheral nervous system, which consists of the sensory pathways. These are the nerves or the neurons, the sensory pathways and the motor pathways. Remember, these ones, they receive the stimuli via the receptors, and then they convert the stimuli into an impulse and take it to the central nervous system for interpretation. And then the motor one, they respond to the changes in the environment. Now, the motor pathways, they consist of the somatic one part and the autonomic part. This part is the voluntary part. This part is the autonomic part. This one, you control it yourself. This one, you do not control it. It happens automatically. And then we've got the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. Remember, the sympathetic division is what we call the flight or fight. And then this part is what we call the rest and digest. I think I need to actually make a video of these two uh, types of nervous systems, which are under the autonomic nervous system of the peripheral nervous system. What you need to know at this moment is that the nervous system divides into two parts, the peripheral and the central nervous system. And the central divides into the brain, the spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system, which is the system of nerves, is made up of the sensory nerves and the motor nerves. These ones, they receive stimuli transmitted to the CNS. This one says transmit stimuli from the CNS to the effector for response. And then it is divided into somatic, which is voluntary, and autonomic, which is involuntary. And then this autonomic is divided into the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. Thank you so much, guys, for watching my video. I hope to see you on the next one. Thank you so much.